With the midterms now less than a year away, in this video we'll be taking a look at the 2026 US Senate map based on the latest polling averages from every single race. Republicans come in with a very strong 53-seat majority following their success in 2024, where they flipped Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. And today we'll see whether or not polling indicates they'll be able to hold on to control of the upper chamber of Congress. And so we're just going to jump right into it, starting off with the solid states, races that will go easily to either party by margins of 15 percentage points or more. These states are not going to be competitive, and they're not going to be consequential. And so we'll begin with the safe red states, where we have Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and South Carolina. And for the Democrats, we have Ohio, Illinois, Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, where we have a poll showing incumbent Democratic Senator Ed Markey defeating his Republican opponent by 19 points. This poll was conducted earlier this year. Markey is on track to win a third term, and he is actually the oldest Democrat running for re-election next year. And so with these safe states filled in for both parties, the GOP takes an early lead with 45 seats, Democrats at just 40. We're now left with the 15 states that will actually determine the balance of power in the U.S. Senate following the midterms. These races will actually matter, and so we're now going to move on to filling in the likely states, races that will be categorized by margins of 5 to 15 points. And we'll begin with the likely red states, starting down south in Florida, where Ashley Moody leads Jennifer Jenkins, the Democratic frontrunner, by 9 points. She was appointed earlier this year by Governor Ron DeSantis to fill the vacancy left by Marco Rubio, and she is going to easily win another 2 years, and then in 2028 she'll be able to run for a full 6 years. And looking at Marco Rubio's last Senate election, he won by 16 points against Val Demings in 2022. Florida is now a red state, and Moody is going to easily win the special election. Next up, we have Texas, the only other likely state on this map, where we have a very interesting primary on the Republican side between incumbent John Cornyn, who has been in the Senate since 2002, and Ken Paxton, the current Attorney General of the state of Texas. He represents the more MAGA wing of the Republican Party. Meanwhile, John Cornyn is much more heavily tied to the establishment. And according to the betting markets on Kalshi, it's basically a dead heat between the two top candidates. Ken Paxton has a 42% chance of being the nominee, John Cornyn at 41%. And so ultimately, it is going to be very close. But for now, I'm going to assume that Cornyn is going to win the primary, as he is the incumbent, and the odds are basically a coin toss between him and Paxton. And according to the polling data, between John Cornyn and Colin Allred, John Cornyn leads by 5.2%. Colin Allred was the Democratic nominee in 2024, where he lost to Ted Cruz by nearly 9 points. He's basically shored up the Democratic nomination at this point. So on the left, it's going to be Allred. On the right, things are a bit cloudier. But for now, if it is John Cornyn, the GOP is on track to win by at least 5 points. Texas will be the second and last likely red state on our map. We're now going to move on to the likely blue states, races the Democrats are going to win by at least 5 points, and we'll begin out west with Colorado and New Mexico. In Colorado, John Hickenlooper is on track to win a second term, and in New Mexico, it's going to be Ben Ray Lujan. We don't have polling data from these two races, but we do have data from every other race remaining. As 2025 comes to an end, we are getting more and more polls every single week as the 2026 midterms really start to heat up. And so moving on east to Virginia, we do have polling between Mark Warner and Glenn Youngkin, where Warner leads by 7 points. Glenn Youngkin is the current governor of Virginia. He is going to leave office early next year, as governors in Virginia cannot run for a second consecutive term. And so he probably will run for the presidency at some point, likely in 2028. And so that is a reason why he may not jump into this race, because we are still waiting for Youngkin to decide whether or not he is going to run for the Senate against Warner, although it does seem less likely now than it did a year ago. And so Mark Warner, without Glenn Youngkin as the challenger, will pretty easily win re-election. He is very much part of the establishment of the Democratic Party, and he is going to get the nomination, so it's not going to be too difficult for him in Virginia. The state is going to be likely blue. We now have 10 races left, but only one likely state left, and that final likely state will be North Carolina, as surprising as that may be, as this is currently a seat held by Republican Thom Tillis, who barely won re-election in 2020, and so he has decided that he will not run for a third term in 2026, and so we now have a matchup between former Democratic Governor Roy Cooper and former chair of the Republican National Committee, Michael Whatley. And so both candidates have basically shored up their nominations. Whatley already has the support of President Trump, and so it is going to be Cooper versus Whatley in November. And looking at the polling data, Roy Cooper does lead by 5 points, although it is early in the election, as people know Roy Cooper a lot better than Whatley. Michael Whatley is more of a national figure, while of course Roy Cooper was governor for 8 years. And so as time goes on, I do expect the numbers to creep up for Whatley. I'm not saying he is necessarily going to win. However, this election is going to be close. Looking at the betting markets on Kalshi, Democrats have a 68% chance, Republicans at 32%. A 1 in 3 chance is not insignificant by any means. North Carolina is going to be close, a lot closer than what the polling may suggest. But for now, based solely on the data, the Tar Heel State will be the final likely blue race on our map. And so this means that we have 9 states that will be decided by less than 5 points based on the polls so far. And so we're now going to move on to the lean red states. These are states that Republicans will win by margins of 1 to 5. And so beginning up in the Midwest, we have Iowa, where Joni Ernst is retiring and will not seek re-election to a third term. Instead, Ashley Hinson will be at the top of the Republican ticket. And we don't have any polls yet with Hinson in them. However, we do have a poll from earlier this year with Joni Ernst up against Josh Turek, the Democratic nominee, and it does show Ernst leading by 4. Ultimately, Ashley Hinson is probably going to do better than Joni Ernst would have done, as she is not popular in her home state. But for now, based on the only poll that we have, Iowa will be placed into the lean Republican category, with the GOP up by 4. In nearby Michigan, we have what is probably going to be the second flip on our map. And in Michigan, we have another retiring incumbent, just like in North Carolina. This time, it's Democrat Gary Peters, who was barely reelected in 2020, just like Thom Tillis, and he will also be retiring after just 2 terms. He won by less than 2% in 2020. And so this means that on the Democratic side, we have an open primary, and it's going to be very, very close. We have 3 big candidates that have a significant chance of winning, but for now, Mallory McMorrow has emerged as the frontrunner. She is a state senator, and she will likely run against Mike Rogers, the Republican nominee. He already has the support of President Trump. He is going to win the nomination. It's basically a formality at this point. And so Mike Rogers was the nominee in 2024, and he did exceptionally well considering the funding and support that he got from national Republicans. He ran against Alyssa Slotkin for the open seat that was left open by Debbie Stabenow, and Alyssa Slotkin was supposed to win by 6, 7, 8%. Ultimately, she won by less than half a percentage point. Nobody thought that Mike Rogers was even going to get close, but this election was the closest Senate election of the entire year. And so Mike Rogers is a very strong candidate on the Republican side, and he has chosen to run again. And according to the polling data, he leads by 3.5% against Mallory McMorrow. The numbers are a bit closer than where they were earlier in the year. However, Republicans do have a clear lead in the Michigan Senate election. And so based on the data, Mike Rogers is on track to flip the seat. This is going to be the second flip on our map. Michigan will be lean Republican. We have another very interesting race in neighboring Ohio, where former Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown is trying to win back his seat to the Senate. He lost in 2024 to Bernie Moreno, but he is now running again against incumbent John Husted. Husted was appointed earlier this year by Governor Mike DeWine to fill the vacancy left by J.D. Vance, and so this is another special election, and according to the polls, John Husted leads by 2.2%. This race has been tightening over the last few months, as in the summer, Husted led by nearly 5, and so it is going to be close, but Republicans do have a clear advantage here. Ohio is no longer the swing state that it once was. Looking at the presidential results, Donald Trump carried the Buckeye State by a double-digit margin. 11.2% was his margin against Kamala Harris, and the betting markets also have Republicans with the advantage at a 61% chance of winning. This race is going to be closer than it would be without Sherrod Brown as the Democratic nominee, but ultimately he is unlikely to win. Ohio will be lean Republican, and it will be the last lean red state on the map. We're now going to move on to the lean blue states. Races Democrats will win by 1 to 5, and we'll begin up in the Northeast, where we have an election between Chris Pappas, the Democratic frontrunner, to replace Jeanne Shaheen, who will be retiring after nearly 2 decades in the Senate. He will run against John Sununu, a former U.S. Senator who was actually Jeanne Shaheen's predecessor in the early 2000s. And so he is trying to win his seat back after nearly 2 decades out of politics. And according to the polls, Chris Pappas leads by 3.5%, but this is going to be a very close race. According to the markets on Kalshi, Republicans have a 1 in 5 chance of winning a Senate election in New Hampshire. That's a pretty big deal, as the state does typically lean towards the Democrats by quite a bit. And of course, John Sununu is a member of the Sununu family who is very popular in the state. We just saw Chris Sununu, his brother, win re-election to governor 3 times in the last 8 years. And so New Hampshire is going to be a lot closer than what the polls suggest, without a doubt. But for now, based on the data, the Granite State will be lean blue. New Hampshire will give Democrats their 45th seat. Coming back to the South, we have the last race in the Deep South, and that is going to be in Georgia, where Jon Ossoff is fighting for his political career. If he ever wants to become a president or vice president or run for some other higher office, he is going to have to win his re-election to the U.S. Senate, which is going to be difficult to do in a state like Georgia. It is a very competitive state, a state that Joe Biden did win in 2020, but by less than 1/4 of a percentage point before Donald Trump won it back in 2024 by over 2 points. And so Jon Ossoff will be running against Mike Collins. Mike Collins is a former trucker and a current member of Congress that already has the endorsement of President Trump. And according to the polls, this race just keeps getting closer and closer. Back in May, Ossoff led by 5. Now he leads by less than half of that. He's ahead by 2.3% against Mike Collins in the most recent polling average. And so Georgia is going to be very, very close, but for now, Democrats retain still a very slight advantage. Next up in Minnesota, we have an election between Peggy Flanagan, the current lieutenant governor serving with Tim Walz, and Royce White, who was a Republican nominee in 2024 that lost by a solid margin to Amy Klobuchar, although Amy Klobuchar is wildly popular in Minnesota. So Royce White is going to fare better against Flanagan, but Democrats are slightly favored still, as according to the only poll that we have between Peggy Flanagan and a generic Republican, she leads by 2%. We don't have any polls with Royce White in them yet. However, we will be keeping an eye on this race, as 2% is not significant for Democrats at all, especially considering their poor performance in 2024, where Kamala Harris carried the state by just 4 points, even though Tim Walz, the state's literal governor, was her running mate. And so Minnesota is going to be close, and according to the polls, Democrats lead by just 2. And the final lean state on this map will be Maine, where Susan Collins is running for a 6th term in office. She is already Maine's longest-serving member of Congress in the state's history, and she won re-election by nearly 9 points in 2020, when every single poll had her losing the election to Maine House Speaker Sarah Gideon. So Susan Collins is very good at winning elections in Maine, even though she's a Republican. It's a state that leans towards the Democrats by nearly 10 points. Joe Biden won it by 10 in 2020. And so Susan Collins has been able to win 5 terms. However, each time it does get a bit more difficult. And this 6th term is not going to be any different, as Graham Plattner leads by 2 points in the polling average against Collins. In the first poll between them, it was a tie. However, in the second, Graham Plattner leads by 2%. We have a very close primary on the Democratic side, with Plattner representing the progressive side of the Democratic Party. And on the establishment side, we have Janet Mills, the incoming governor, who is actually older than Susan Collins. And according to the betting markets for the Democratic primary, Graham Plattner is at 67%. Janet Mills, the governor, is at 34%. And so it's looking increasingly likely that Mills will not be the Democratic nominee. And that is a good thing for Democrats, as Plattner does poll better against Susan Collins than Janet Mills. If the average was between Mills and Collins instead of Plattner, we would actually see Susan Collins in the lead. And according to the betting markets for the race as a whole, Democrats are at 61, Republicans at 40. It's basically a dead heat. This is going to be a very close race, and a 2-point polling advantage is not going to be enough for Democrats. Sarah Gideon was leading by 5-6 points in the weeks leading up to the election, and she lost by 8. So Democrats are going to have to take a much larger lead in the polls if they are actually going to defeat Susan Collins in November. But based solely on just the data, Maine will be the final lean state on our map. And so with Republicans at 50 seats and Democrats at 48, we have 2 races remaining that will be decided by less than 1%, at least based on the polls. Ultimately, though, these 2 final races are not actually going to be that close. And so we'll begin in Alaska, where Republicans lead by 0.8%, with Dan Sullivan slightly ahead of Mary Peltola. Sullivan is running for a 3rd term, and Alaska is not a very competitive state, although Mary Peltola is the best candidate Democrats could potentially put up. And I say potentially because Mary Peltola hasn't even officially entered the race. There's a good chance she'll actually run for governor instead. And many of the polls that go into this average were conducted by Democratic-funded organizations. And so Dan Sullivan is likely to come out on top even if Peltola runs. Peltola just lost her House seat in 2024. That is why she is considering running for the U.S. Senate. She may actually run for her House seat again. So there are a lot of options open for Peltola. And so Alaska is going to remain red even if she runs for it. It is going to be closer, though. But Alaska is a state that Trump carried by 13 points in 2024. The Senate seat is not going to go to a Democrat. But just based on the data, Alaska will be tilted Republican. And finally, in Nebraska, Nebraska is typically a solid red state. The only reason why it's close is because we have an independent running against incumbent Republican Pete Ricketts. And so Pete Ricketts was able to win a special election pretty easily in 2024. Meanwhile, Deb Fischer was challenged by independent Dan Osborne, and she won by less than 7. And so Osborne is going to run again, this time against Ricketts. And Ricketts is a pretty new senator. He was appointed to fill the vacancy left by Ben Sasse. And Dan Osborne has been pretty effective in campaigning. If he was a Democrat, he would stand no chance. But as an independent, he has been able to perform pretty well in Nebraska, and according to the polling average, we do have a tie. However, both polls were funded by Democrats, and so ultimately Pete Ricketts would be slightly ahead here, as these polls definitely overestimated Osborne's support. According to the betting markets, Pete Ricketts has a 77% chance of winning. Nebraska really is not going to be that close. The state will be tilt Republican on our map, but in reality, it is going to be probably a likely red state. Pete Ricketts is probably going to win by at least 5. And so this is it. This is the 2026 U.S. Senate map based solely on the polling averages. This is just simply based on an aggregate of all the data that we have so far. Of course, I don't agree with every single one of these characterizations. However, based on the numbers so far, Republicans are on track to flip Michigan, while Democrats take Maine and North Carolina. Although in reality, I do expect Maine to actually remain red, at least for now. North Carolina, though, I do think Roy Cooper has a very good chance. And I do agree that Michigan will probably flip in favor of Republican Mike Rogers. However, I do think that Nebraska and Alaska are not going to be nearly as close as our limited data currently shows. But this is the map based on the numbers, and it is not going to be too far off from the final results. Republicans at 52 seats. This means that they will be able to retain control of the U.S. Senate for the second half of President Trump's term. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like this video down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below, do you agree with this map? Are there any things that you would change? And of course, subscribe to the channel for more content just like this leading up to the midterms next year.